I never imagined that my hands, roughened by years of needle and thread, would one day wear the ring of a duke. Yet here I stood in the chapel of Hargrave Manor, speaking vows I did not mean to a man whose eyes held nothing but cold calculation. The morning had begun like any other in the servants' quarters, with the pale light of dawn filtering through the narrow window above my workbench. I had been stitching the hem of a gown for Lady Pemberton, my fingers moving with the practiced rhythm of someone who had spent a lifetime making beautiful things for women who would never remember my name. The silk whispered beneath my touch, and I found a strange comfort in the repetition, in the certainty that each stitch would hold, that my work would endure even if I did not. I had learned long ago not to dream beyond the walls of the sewing room, not to imagine a life different from the one I had been given. My mother had been a seamstress, and her mother before her. It was honest work, respectable work, and I told myself it was enough. But that morning, everything changed. Mrs. Dawson, the head housekeeper, appeared at my door with an expression I had never seen on her usually composed face. There was something like pity in her eyes, mixed with a sharp curiosity that made my stomach tighten with unease. She told me that Lord Hargrave requested my presence in his study immediately, and the way she said it, the careful neutrality of her tone, told me this was no ordinary summons. I set down my needle, smoothed my simple gray dress, and followed her through the corridors I had walked 1,000 times, yet which suddenly felt unfamiliar, as though I were seeing them for the first time. The study was a room I had entered only once before, years ago, to deliver a repaired waistcoat. It was a masculine space, lined with books whose leather spines gleamed in the firelight, filled with the scent of tobacco and old paper. Lord Adrian Hargrave stood by the window, his back to me, his tall frame silhouetted against the gray morning sky. He did not turn when I entered, did not acknowledge my presence for a long moment, and I stood there in silence, my hands clasped before me, wondering what transgression I had committed to warrant this audience. I had always kept my distance from the family, had always understood my place in the hierarchy of the household. I was invisible, as all servants were meant to be, and I had never given anyone reason to notice me. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He told me that circumstances had arisen which required immediate action, that his late wife's indiscretions had come to light in a manner that threatened the family's reputation and, more importantly, the future of his daughter. I knew of Lady Catherine's death 2 years prior, knew the whispers that had circulated among the staff about her unhappiness, her frequent absences, the gentlemen callers who arrived when Lord Hargrave was away. I had never paid much attention to the gossip, had trained myself to focus only on my work, but now those half-remembered fragments assembled themselves into a picture I did not want to see. He turned then, and I saw his face properly for the first time. Lord Adrian Hargrave was a man of perhaps 35 years, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples and eyes the color of slate in winter. He was handsome in the way that powerful men often are, with sharp features that spoke of generations of breeding and privilege. But there was a hardness in his expression, a coldness that seemed to radiate from him like frost. He looked at me as though I were a problem to be solved, a piece on a chessboard to be moved into position. He told me, without preamble or softening, that he required a wife, that the scandal surrounding his late wife's behavior demanded he present to society a united, respectable household, and that I, Eleanor Whitmore, would serve this purpose. I stood there, certain I had misheard him, certain that this was some cruel joke or test. But his expression did not change, and he continued speaking in that same flat, businesslike tone. He explained that marriage to someone of low station would actually benefit his position, would demonstrate to society that he was a man of principle, who valued virtue over pedigree, who had chosen a modest, moral woman to mother his child and restore dignity to his house. He made it clear that this would be a marriage in name only, a social arrangement designed to silence the wagging tongues and protect his daughter from the stain of her mother's sins. He would provide for me handsomely, ensure my comfort, ask nothing of me beyond my presence at his side when society required it. In return, I would be elevated from seamstress to duchess, would want for nothing, would have security for the rest of my life. I found my voice then, though it emerged shakier than I would have liked. I asked him why he had chosen me, of all the women in his household or in society who might serve this purpose better. He looked at me with something that might have been surprise, as though he had not expected me to question him at all. He said that I was known to be quiet, hard-working and discreet, that I had no family to complicate matters, no connections that might prove troublesome. He said that I was plain enough not to attract unwanted attention, but presentable enough to appear in public without causing embarrassment. He delivered these observations without malice, as simple facts, and somehow that made them cut deeper than any insult could have. I should have refused him. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to walk away, to return to my sewing room and my simple life, to avoid entangling myself in the affairs of the nobility. But even as these thoughts raced through my mind, I was calculating, weighing the realities of my situation against the fantasy of refusal. I was 26 years old, unmarried, with no prospects and no family. I worked from dawn until late into the night for wages that barely kept me fed and clothed. I had no future beyond these walls, no hope of anything better. And beneath all of that practical reasoning, there was something else, something I was almost ashamed to acknowledge. There was a small, stubborn part of me that was curious, that wondered what it might be like to walk through the world as someone who mattered, even if it was all a performance. So I told him yes, but with conditions. I told him that I would marry him, would play the role he required, but that I would not pretend to be what I was not. I would not simper or bow or scrape. I would not call him my lord or treat him with the deference that society expected. I would be his wife in name, would appear at his side when required, but I would not be his possession, would not surrender my dignity or my autonomy. I would call him Adrian as an equal might, and I would expect to be treated with the same respect he afforded to anyone else in his household. I spoke these terms clearly, watching his face for signs of anger or dismissal, fully expecting him to rescind his offer. Instead, he regarded me with what might have been a flicker of interest, the first real emotion I had seen cross his features. He was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes studying me as though seeing me for the first time. Then he nodded once, curtly, and told me that my terms were acceptable. He said that the marriage would take place in 3 days, that Mrs. Dawson would assist me with the necessary preparations, and that I should tell no one outside the household of the arrangement. He dismissed me then, turning back to the window, and I left the study feeling as though I had just made a bargain with consequences I could not yet fathom. The next 3 days passed in a blur of activity and disbelief. Mrs. Dawson and the other senior staff treated me with a strange mixture of deference and suspicion, unsure how to behave towards someone who had been their equal just days before. A dressmaker was summoned to create a simple but elegant gown for the ceremony, and I stood for hours while she pinned and measured, her fingers far less skilled than my own. I wanted to take the fabric from her hands and do the work myself, but I understood that such a thing was no longer appropriate. I was no longer Eleanor the seamstress. I was about to become Eleanor, Duchess of Hargrave, and the thought filled me with equal parts terror and a strange, defiant pride. The ceremony itself was brief and private, attended only by the household staff and a nervous young vicar who stumbled over his words. Adrian stood beside me, tall and impassive in his dark coat, and I felt the weight of his ring as he slipped it onto my finger. It was too large, clearly not made for me, likely his late wife's ring or one pulled from the family collection. I made my vows in a steady voice, refusing to let it waver, refusing to show the fear that churned in my stomach. When the vicar pronounced us man and wife, Adrian did not kiss me. He simply nodded, as though we had just concluded a business transaction, and offered me his arm to lead me from the chapel. That evening, I was shown to my new chambers, a suite of rooms that adjoined Adrian's own. The bedroom was larger than any space I had ever occupied, with windows that overlooked the gardens and furniture that gleamed with polish. A fire burned in the grate, and candles cast soft light over the pale blue walls. It was beautiful, tasteful, and utterly foreign to me. I stood in the center of the room, still wearing the simple cream gown from the ceremony, and felt the weight of what I had done settle over me like a shroud. I had married a man I did not know, had agreed to a life I did not understand, and I had no idea whether I had made the wisest decision of my life or the greatest mistake. A soft knock at the door broke my reverie, and a maid entered with a tray of tea and small cakes. She curtsied to me, actually curtsied, and called me "Your Grace," and I felt a wild urge to laugh or cry or both. I thanked her quietly, and she left, and I was alone again with my thoughts and my fears. I moved to the window and looked out at the darkening gardens, at the carefully manicured paths and the roses that bloomed despite the approaching autumn. Somewhere in this vast house, Adrian was going about his evening, perhaps relieved to have solved his problem so efficiently, perhaps already regretting his choice. And somewhere else in these halls was his daughter, the child I had agreed to help protect, though I had not yet met her or even learned her name. I thought about my mother then, about what she would have said if she could see me now. She had always told me to be proud of my work, to take satisfaction in the things I created with my own hands. She had warned me never to aspire beyond my station, never to forget that people like us were meant to serve, not to lead. But she was gone now, had been for 5 years, and I was alone in the world with only my skills and my stubbornness to sustain me. Perhaps she would have understood. Perhaps she would have told me that survival sometimes requires compromise, that dignity can be found in unexpected places. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in the enormous bed, surrounded by soft linens and the scent of lavender, and listened to the sounds of the house settling around me. At some point, I heard footsteps in the corridor, heard the door to Adrian's chamber open and close. I wondered if he was thinking about me, about the strange woman he had bound himself to. I wondered if he regretted his choice, if he lay awake weighing the wisdom of what he had done. But I suspected that men like Adrian Hargrave did not waste time on regret. They made their decisions and moved forward, confident in their own judgment. In the morning, I woke to find that someone had laid out clothes for me, a simple but well-made day dress in a soft gray blue that matched my eyes. I dressed myself, refusing to ring for a maid, and stood before the mirror, trying to recognize the woman who looked back at me. She wore fine clothes and an expensive ring, but her hands were still rough, her face still plain. She was still Eleanor, still the girl who had learned to sew by candlelight, still the woman who knew the price of every yard of fabric and every spool of thread. The title might change how others saw me, but it could not change who I was. I made my way downstairs, unsure of what was expected of me, and found Adrian in the breakfast room, reading correspondence over his coffee. He looked up when I entered, and for a moment our eyes met, and I saw something flicker across his face, something I could not quite identify. He gestured to the seat across from him, and I sat, accepting a cup of tea from the hovering footman. We ate in silence, the only sound the rustle of paper and the clink of china. It was awkward, uncomfortable, and I felt the absurdity of the situation pressing down on me. We were married, bound together in the eyes of God and society, yet we were strangers, separated by class and experience and expectation. Finally, Adrian set down his paper and looked at me directly. He told me that his daughter, Isabel, would be brought down from the nursery after breakfast, and that he hoped I would make an effort to win her affection. He said that the child had been withdrawn since her mother's death, that she trusted no one, and that part of the purpose of this marriage was to provide her with a maternal figure. He spoke about his daughter the way he spoke about everything else, with a kind of detached efficiency, as though she were another problem requiring management. I found myself feeling a stab of sympathy for this child I had not yet met, this little girl who had lost her mother and been left with a father who seemed incapable of warmth. I told him that I could not promise to replace her mother, but that I would do my best to be kind to her. He seemed satisfied with this answer and returned to his correspondence. I finished my tea and waited, my heart beating faster at the thought of meeting Isabel, of seeing the child whose future had become entangled with my own. I wondered what she would think of me, this woman from the servants' quarters who had suddenly appeared as her new mother. I wondered if she would see through the pretense, if children were more perceptive than adults about such things. When Isabel was finally brought in by her nurse, I felt my breath catch in my throat. She was perhaps 6 years old, small and delicate with her father's dark hair and eyes that seemed too large for her pale face. She wore a white dress with blue ribbons, and she clutched a worn doll in her arms. She looked at me with an expression of such solemn wariness that it broke my heart. Adrian introduced us with his usual formality, telling Isabel that I was to be her new mama, and I watched the child's face close off even further, if that were possible. She curtsied to me, a perfect little curtsy that had clearly been drilled into her, and said nothing. I knelt down so that I was at her level, ignoring the impropriety of such a gesture. I told her that my name was Eleanor, and that I had once been very good at making dresses for dolls. I asked her if her doll might need a new dress, and I saw a flicker of something in those dark eyes, a spark of interest quickly suppressed. She looked at her father as though seeking permission, and he nodded almost imperceptibly. She told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that her doll's dress was torn and she did not know how to fix it. I smiled and told her that we could fix it together, that I could teach her if she liked. For the first time, I saw the ghost of a smile cross her small face, and something tight in my chest loosened just a little. Adrian watched this exchange with an unreadable expression, and when Isabel's nurse came to collect her for her lessons, he dismissed them both with a wave of his hand. When we were alone again, he told me that I had done well, that Isabel had responded to me better than he had expected. I looked at him, at this cold man who spoke of his daughter as though she were a project showing promising results, and I felt a surge of anger that surprised me with its intensity. I told him that Isabel was not a problem to be managed, that she was a child who needed love and patience, not strategy and calculation. He stared at me for a long moment, and I saw something harden in his eyes. He told me, in a voice that could have cut glass, that I would do well to remember my place, that he had not married me to be lectured on how to manage his household or his child. He reminded me that this was an arrangement of convenience, that I was here to serve a purpose, and that I should not mistake his tolerance for weakness. He stood then, gathering his papers, and left the room without another word, leaving me alone with my tea and my tumultuous thoughts. I sat there for a long time after he left, my hands wrapped around my cup for warmth, trying to understand what I had gotten myself into. I had known this would not be a love match, had accepted from the beginning that Adrian saw me as a tool rather than a partner. But I had not been prepared for the coldness, for the way he could speak of his child as though she were a piece of property. I had not been prepared for the loneliness of this beautiful prison, or for the way my own pride would chafe against the expectations placed upon me. I had agreed to this marriage to secure my future, to escape the endless drudgery of the sewing room, but I was beginning to wonder if I had traded one form of servitude for another. And yet, when I thought of Isabel's small face, of the way she had looked at me with such desperate hope before remembering to guard herself, I felt something shift inside me. Perhaps this marriage could serve a purpose beyond my own survival. Perhaps I could make a difference in this child's life, could offer her the gentleness and understanding that her father seemed incapable of providing. It was not the grand romance I had once dreamed of as a young girl, before life had taught me the futility of such dreams. But it was something, a reason to be here beyond mere self-preservation. I rose from the table and made my way through the house, learning the layout of my new home. I passed servants who bowed and murmured greetings, their faces carefully neutral. I explored the library, running my fingers along the spines of books I had never had time or permission to read. I walked through the portrait gallery, studying the faces of Adrian's ancestors, all those lords and ladies who had lived and loved and died in this house. I wondered what they would think of me, this interloper from the servants' quarters who wore their family ring. I wondered if any of them had married for love, or if all of these unions had been as calculated as my own. That afternoon, I found my way to the sewing room where I had spent so many hours of my life. It was on the 3rd floor, tucked away in a corner of the house where the quality rarely ventured. The room was exactly as I had left it, with my workbench and my tools and the half-finished gown still waiting for my attention. I stood in the doorway, breathing in the familiar scent of fabric and thread, and felt tears prick at my eyes. This had been my sanctuary, my place of purpose and competence. Here, I had known who I was and what I was meant to do. Now, I was adrift in a world of rules I did not understand, playing a role I had not rehearsed. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Mrs. Dawson standing there, her expression sympathetic. She told me gently that the room had been reassigned to another seamstress, that it would not be appropriate for me to continue working there. I nodded, understanding but grieving nonetheless. She asked me if I needed anything, if there was anything she could do to help me adjust to my new position. I thanked her and told her I was fine, and she left me alone with my memories and my regrets. I took one last look at the room, committing every detail to memory, and then I closed the door and walked away. That night, I dined alone in my chambers, as Adrian had sent word that he was engaged elsewhere. I was relieved, I told myself, grateful for the solitude. But as I sat by the fire with my untouched meal, I felt the weight of the silence pressing down on me. I thought about my wedding day, about the vows I had spoken without meaning them, about the ring that felt heavy on my finger. I thought about Adrian's cold eyes and Isabel's wounded ones, about the life I had left behind and the uncertain future that stretched before me. I had made my choice, had spoken my conditions, had refused to bow or call him my lord. But I was beginning to understand that defiance was easier than living with its consequences, that standing up for one's dignity could be a lonely business. I went to bed that night with my door unlocked, though I knew Adrian would not come. This was a marriage of convenience, he had made that clear. There would be no intimacy between us, no warmth or affection. We would live parallel lives in this great house, intersecting only when society demanded it. It was what I had agreed to, what I had insisted upon. But as I lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around me, I felt a longing I could not name, a hollow ache for something I had never known and probably never would. I had married a duke to save his name, and in doing so, I had saved myself from a life of poverty and obscurity. But I wondered, as sleep finally claimed me, what exactly I had gained and what I might have lost in the bargain. The days that followed my marriage settled into a pattern that was both predictable and suffocating. I woke each morning in that enormous bed, dressed in clothes that still felt like costumes, and navigated a world where everyone knew the rules except me. Adrian and I maintained a careful distance, speaking only when necessary, our conversations formal and brief. We took breakfast together because propriety demanded it, but he buried himself in his correspondence, and I stared out the windows at gardens I was not yet brave enough to explore. We were two strangers sharing a house, bound by a contract neither of us had any intention of honoring beyond its most basic terms. But there was Isabel, and she became my anchor in those disorienting first weeks. Every afternoon, after her lessons with her governess, she would come to my sitting room, clutching her worn doll with the torn dress. At first, she sat stiffly on the edge of the sofa, watching me with those enormous dark eyes, saying nothing unless I asked her a direct question. But slowly, gradually, as I began to repair her doll's dress and showed her how to make the tiny stitches, she started to relax. She asked me questions about sewing, about how I had learned, about whether I had always lived at Hargrave Manor. I answered her honestly, telling her that I had been a seamstress, that I had worked with my hands, that I had not been born into a grand house like this one. I saw the confusion in her face when I told her these things, the way she tried to reconcile this information with her understanding of the world. She had been raised to believe that duchesses were born, not made, that there was an unbridgeable gulf between people like her father and people like the servants who brought her meals and cleaned her nursery. But here I was, proof that the boundaries she had been taught to respect were not as fixed as she had believed. She asked me once, in her small, careful voice, whether that meant she could be a seamstress someday if she wanted to be. I told her that she could be anything she wished, though even as I said it, I knew it was not entirely true. The world had very definite ideas about what girls like Isabel could and could not do, and my own unusual circumstances did not change that reality. As I spent more time with Isabel, I began to understand the depth of her wounds. She rarely smiled, rarely played with the expensive toys that filled her nursery. She spoke of her mother only once, telling me in a whisper that Mama had been beautiful and sad and had smelled of roses. She told me that Mama had cried a lot, especially at night, and that Papa had stopped coming to see her. She said these things matter-of-factly, as children do, not understanding the weight of what she was revealing. I held her hand as she talked, feeling a fierce protectiveness rise up in me, a desire to shield her from the pain that had already marked her young life. I asked Adrian once, during one of our strained breakfasts, about Isabel's education and whether she had companions her own age. He looked up from his papers with that expression of mild surprise he always wore when I addressed him directly. He told me that Isabel had a governess who was perfectly adequate, and that he saw no need for her to associate with other children until she was older and better able to conduct herself properly. I felt my temper flare at this, at his casual dismissal of his daughter's need for friendship and joy. I told him that Isabel was not a miniature adult, that she was a child who needed more than lessons and rules, that she needed warmth and laughter and the chance to simply be young. His face hardened at my words, and he set down his cup with a sharp click against the saucer. He informed me, in a tone that brooked no argument, that he had not asked for my opinion on how to raise his daughter, and that I would do well to focus on the role I had been brought here to perform rather than overstepping my bounds. He reminded me that I was his wife in name only, that our arrangement did not give me authority over his household or his child. I stared at him across the table, at this man who could speak so coldly about the little girl I had come to care for, and I felt something break inside me, some last fragile hope that there might be kindness beneath his icy exterior. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, and I told him that he could dictate the terms of our marriage, could control where I went and what I wore and whom I spoke to, but he could not stop me from caring about Isabel. I told him that whether he liked it or not, I had become attached to his daughter, and I would continue to spend time with her and try to bring some small measure of happiness into her lonely existence. I told him that he could command many things, but he could not command me to be indifferent to a child who so clearly needed someone to see her, truly see her, beyond her value as an heir and a pawn in society's games. Adrian stood as well, his tall frame seeming to fill the room, and for a moment I thought he might shout at me, might remind me forcefully of my place. But instead, he simply looked at me with an expression I could not read, something that might have been anger or confusion or something else entirely. He told me, his voice quiet but edged with steel, that I knew nothing about his daughter or his circumstances, and that my sentimental notions about childhood and happiness were both naive and unhelpful. He said that Isabel needed structure and discipline, needed to be prepared for the responsibilities she would one day shoulder. Then he left the breakfast room, leaving me standing there alone, my hands trembling with rage and frustration. I retreated to my chambers after that confrontation, needing solitude to collect myself. I had known that Adrian was cold, had understood from the beginning that he was a man more comfortable with ledgers than with people. But I had not expected this particular brand of cruelty, this willful blindness to his own daughter's suffering. I thought about my own childhood, about how my mother had worked herself to exhaustion, but had always made time to hold me, to tell me stories, to make me feel loved despite our poverty. Adrian had every material advantage in the world, but he could not or would not give Isabel the one thing she needed most. That afternoon, when Isabel came to my sitting room as usual, I made a decision. I told her to fetch her cloak and her warmest shoes, that we were going out to the gardens. She looked at me with surprise and a touch of fear, telling me that she was not allowed in the gardens without her governess or nurse to supervise. I told her that she was with me now, and that I was her stepmother and a duchess, and that meant I could decide where she went and with whom. I saw a spark of excitement in her eyes, quickly tamped down by years of caution, but she went to get her cloak without further protest. We walked through the gardens in the pale autumn sunshine, and I watched as Isabel slowly came alive in ways I had not seen before. She ran her fingers along the hedges, examined the late blooming roses, picked up smooth pebbles from the paths and tucked them into her pockets. She asked me the names of flowers and plants, and when I did not know, I told her we would find out together. We walked all the way to the small lake at the edge of the property, where ducks paddled in the cold water and the willow trees trailed their branches like yellow curtains. Isabel stood at the water's edge, her cheeks pink from the cold air, and she smiled, truly smiled, for the first time since I had known her. We stayed out until the sun began to sink low, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. As we walked back toward the house, Isabel slipped her small hand into mine, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. She told me, so quietly I almost missed it, that her mother used to take her to the gardens sometimes before she became too sad to leave her rooms. She said she had missed the gardens, had missed feeling the wind on her face and the smell of earth and growing things. She asked me if we could come back tomorrow, and I promised her we would, as often as she liked. We returned to the house to find Adrian waiting in the entrance hall, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He had apparently been informed of our excursion by one of the staff, and he was not pleased. He sent Isabel upstairs with her nurse, despite the child's protests, and then he turned to me with eyes that blazed with anger. He told me that I had no right to remove Isabel from the house without consulting him first, that I had overstepped my authority, that I had put his daughter at risk by taking her out without proper supervision. I listened to his tirade in silence, waiting for him to finish, my own anger building with each word. When he finally stopped speaking, I told him calmly that I had taken Isabel for a walk in the gardens of her own home, not on some perilous expedition. I told him that she was a child, not a prisoner, and that she needed fresh air and exercise and the chance to be something other than a perfectly behaved doll. I told him that if he continued to keep her locked away, continued to treat her like a fragile ornament rather than a living, breathing child, he would break her spirit entirely. I told him that I understood he had married me to serve his purposes, but that I would not stand by and watch him damage his daughter simply because he was too afraid or too proud to show her any affection. His hand shot out and gripped my arm, not hard enough to hurt, but firmly enough to make his point. He pulled me closer to him, so close I could see the fine lines around his eyes, could smell the faint scent of tobacco and ink that clung to him. He told me, his voice low and dangerous, that I had pushed him far enough, that I would not speak to him this way, that I would not presume to judge his parenting when I knew nothing of the burdens he carried. He told me that Isabel was his daughter, his responsibility, and that I was merely a convenience he had taken on to solve a problem. He said that I should remember my place before he reminded me of it in ways I would not enjoy. I looked into his eyes, those cold gray eyes that held so much anger and so much pain buried beneath it, and I did not flinch. I told him that he could threaten me all he liked, but I would not stop caring for Isabel, would not stop trying to give her some small measure of the childhood he seemed determined to deny her. I told him that he had chosen to marry me precisely because I was not some simpering society lady who would bow to his every whim, and that he would have to live with the consequences of that choice. I told him that my place, as he called it, was wherever I decided it should be, and that included by his daughter's side. For a long moment, we stood there locked in that tense silence, his hand still gripping my arm, our faces inches apart. I could feel the heat of his anger, but I could also sense something else, something that flickered beneath the surface like a candle flame behind frosted glass. Then, abruptly, he released me and stepped back, his expression shuddering closed once more. He told me, his voice flat and emotionless, that I could take Isabel to the gardens if I wished, but that I was to ensure she was properly dressed and that I was to inform the staff of our whereabouts at all times. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the marble hallway, leaving me standing there with my arms still tingling from his touch and my heart pounding in my chest. I went to my chambers that evening, feeling both triumphant and shaken. I had stood up to Adrian, had defended Isabel's right to simply be a child, and he had, in his own grudging way, conceded the point. But the encounter had left me unsettled, had revealed depths to this man that I had not anticipated. There was rage in him, yes, but there was also something that looked almost like desperation, a barely contained emotion that he kept locked away behind his walls of ice and formality. I wondered what had made him this way, what had happened to transform what might have been a good man into this cold, controlled creature who could not even show love to his own child. That night, I did something I had not done since arriving at Hargrave Manor. I went to the library, that beautiful room with its thousands of books, and I began to search through the society pages and old newspapers that were kept on the lower shelves. I was looking for information about Lady Catherine, about the scandal that Adrian had mentioned, but never explained. I found references to her in the gossip columns, veiled hints about her unhappiness, her frequent trips to Bath and London without her husband, the mysterious gentlemen who were seen in her company. But there was nothing concrete, nothing that spelled out exactly what had happened or why Adrian felt such urgent need to rehabilitate his family's reputation. I was so absorbed in my reading that I did not hear the door open, did not realize I was no longer alone until Adrian's voice cut through the silence. He asked me what I was doing, and I looked up to find him standing in the doorway, still dressed in his evening clothes, his face unreadable. I considered lying, considered making up some excuse, but I was tired of pretense, tired of dancing around the truth. I told him I was trying to understand what had happened with his wife, trying to make sense of the situation I had been drawn into. I told him I thought I deserved to know the full story, given that I was now part of it whether I liked it or not. He was silent for a long moment, and I thought he might simply turn and leave, might refuse to dignify my curiosity with an answer. But instead, he came into the room, poured himself a brandy from the decanter on the side table, and sat down in the chair across from mine. He looked older in the lamplight, the shadows deepening the lines of his face, and I saw for the first time how tired he was, how much the weight of his responsibilities had cost him. He took a long drink of his brandy, and then he began to speak, his voice low and devoid of emotion, as though he were reciting a list of facts rather than telling the story of his marriage and its dissolution. He told me that he had married Lady Catherine when he was 25 and she was 19, that it had been an arranged match between their families, as such things often were. He said that Catherine had been beautiful and accomplished, everything a duchess should be, but that she had been unhappy from the start. She had expected love, had expected romance and passion, and instead she had gotten a husband who was more interested in managing his estates than in wooing his wife. He said that he had tried, in his own way, to be a good husband, to provide for her, to give her everything she could possibly want. But it had not been enough, had never been enough for a woman who wanted something he did not know how to give. Catherine had taken lovers, he told me, multiple lovers over the years, with increasing recklessness and decreasing discretion. Society had whispered but turned a blind eye, as society often did when titled Ladies Strayed, as long as the appearances were maintained and the family line remained secure. But then she had become pregnant, and when the child was born, when Isabel arrived with her dark hair and eyes so unlike Catherine's fair coloring, the whispers had grown louder. People began to question whether Isabel was truly Adrian's daughter, whether the Hargrave line had been compromised. Catherine had died less than 2 years after Isabel's birth. A fever that came on suddenly and took her within days, and with her death came a resurgence of all the old scandals and speculations. Adrian told me all of this in that same flat, emotionless tone, as though he were discussing the weather or the price of grain. But I could see the tension in his shoulders, could see the way his hand gripped the glass so tightly I thought it might shatter. He told me that Isabel was his daughter, that he had no doubts about her parentage despite what others might whisper. He said that he had loved Catherine once, or thought he had, but that she had destroyed whatever affection he might have felt with her constant demands and her eventual betrayals. He said that he had married me to put an end to the speculation, to present to society a united, respectable household that would silence the gossips and protect Isabel's future. When he finished speaking, he drained his glass and set it down with a heavy thunk on the table between us. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, something that disappeared almost as quickly as it had appeared. He told me that he had answered my questions, had given me the truth I claimed to want, and that he hoped I was satisfied. He said that he would appreciate it if I did not share this information with the household staff or with anyone else, as the whole purpose of our marriage was to bury these scandals once and for all. Then he stood to leave, and I found myself speaking before I could think better of it. I told him that I was sorry for what he had endured, that no one should have to suffer such betrayal and heartbreak. I told him that I could understand now why he guarded himself so carefully, why he found it difficult to show warmth or affection. But I also told him that Isabel was innocent in all of this, that she had done nothing to deserve his coldness, that she needed her father's love more than she needed his protection from gossip. I told him that he was so busy building walls to keep the world out that he had locked himself away from the people who needed him most. I spoke gently, carefully, knowing that I was treading on dangerous ground but unable to remain silent. Adrian looked at me for a long moment, and I saw a flash of something that might have been pain cross his features. But then his expression hardened again, and he told me that I understood nothing about his situation or his relationship with his daughter. He said that love was a luxury he could not afford, that it had brought him nothing but suffering, and that he would not make that mistake again. He said that Isabel was better off learning early that the world was not kind, that people were not to be trusted, that safety lay in discipline and self-control rather than in the false promise of affection. Then he left the library, closing the door quietly behind him, and I sat there alone with the newspapers scattered around me and tears I could not quite explain burning in my eyes. I understood then what I was dealing with, the magnitude of the wounds that Adrian carried. He was not simply cold or cruel. He was a man who had been broken by betrayal, who had learned to equate love with pain and vulnerability with destruction. He had built his fortress of ice not out of indifference but out of self-preservation, and he genuinely believed that he was protecting his daughter by keeping her at arm's length, by teaching her not to need or expect affection. It was a tragedy, I realized, not just for Isabel, but for Adrian himself. He was imprisoning himself along with his daughter, and he could not or would not see it. But I could see it, and I could not unsee it. As I made my way back to my chambers that night, I found myself thinking not just about Isabel but about Adrian as well, about the young man he must have been before disappointment and betrayal had hardened him into this frozen shell. I thought about how lonely he must be, how exhausting it must be to maintain such rigid control over every aspect of his life. I thought about the way his hand had trembled slightly when he held his brandy glass, the only sign that he was not as composed as he pretended to be. And I felt something shift inside me, some small crack in the wall I had built around my own heart. The next morning, I woke with a sense of purpose I had not felt since arriving at Hargrave Manor. I had accepted this marriage as a transaction, a means to an end. But I was beginning to understand that it could be more than that. I could not change the circumstances that had brought me here, could not undo the wounds that Adrian and Isabel had suffered. But I could choose how I responded to those circumstances, could decide what kind of person I wanted to be in this strange new life. I could be merely the convenient wife, the pretty mask that Adrian wore to deceive society. Or I could be something more, something that mattered, someone who made a genuine difference in the lives of these two wounded souls. I dressed carefully that morning, choosing a simple but elegant day dress in deep green, and I made my way down to breakfast with my head held high. Adrian was already there, of course, reading his papers as always. But when I entered the room, he looked up, and for just a moment, our eyes met and held. I saw surprise there, and something that might have been curiosity, as though he were seeing me for the first time. I greeted him politely and took my seat, and we ate in silence as we always did. But it was a different quality of silence this time, less hostile and more expectant, as though we were both waiting for something to happen, though neither of us quite knew what. After breakfast, Adrian did something he had never done before. He asked me if I would join him for a tour of the estate, said that as the lady of the house, I should be familiar with the property and its workings. I was so surprised that I nearly declined out of pure shock, but I caught myself and agreed. We walked through the house first, and he showed me the various rooms and explained their functions, his voice taking on a lecturing quality that I suspected was easier for him than genuine conversation. He showed me the ballroom where Catherine had hosted parties, the music room where she had played the pianoforte, the conservatory where she had kept her collection of exotic plants. He spoke of her matter-of-factly, without emotion, but I could sense the ghosts that haunted these spaces, could almost hear the echo of arguments and tears in these elegant rooms. We ventured outside then, and he showed me the stables and the gardens, the tenant farms and the boundaries of the property. He explained the economics of running an estate, the careful balance of expenditure and income, the responsibilities he bore to the families who depended on him for their livelihoods. As he spoke, I began to see another side of him, a man who took his duties seriously, who worked tirelessly to ensure the prosperity of everyone under his protection. He might be cold and distant with his daughter, might maintain an icy reserve with me, but he was not neglectful or careless. He simply channeled all his capacity for caring into the abstract work of stewardship, where emotions could be kept at bay and results could be measured in ledgers and accounts. We walked for hours, and by the time we returned to the house, the autumn sun was beginning to set. I was tired, my feet aching in my elegant shoes, but I felt something like satisfaction. Adrian had made an effort, had extended what was for him an olive branch. It was not much, not nearly enough, but it was something. As we stood in the entrance hall, preparing to part ways, he thanked me formally for my company and turned to go. But then he paused, his back still to me, and he said something that took me completely by surprise. He said that he had been unfair to me the previous evening, that he should not have lost his temper, and that he appreciated what I was trying to do for Isabel. He said it quickly, awkwardly, as though the words cost him dearly. Then he walked away before I could respond, leaving me standing there with my heart doing strange, uncertain things in my chest. That night, I lay awake thinking about everything that had happened, about the complicated man I had married and the lonely child I had come to love. I thought about the bargain we had made, about the conditions I had set and the walls we had both erected. I thought about his confession in the library, about the pain and betrayal that had shaped him into who he was. And I realized that something was changing, that the clear boundaries I had drawn in my mind were beginning to blur. I had told myself that this was merely a business arrangement, that I would maintain my dignity and my distance. But dignity was a cold companion, and distance was becoming harder to maintain as I saw more clearly the real people beneath the roles we were all playing. I did not know what would happen next, could not predict how this strange marriage would evolve. But I knew that I could not remain unchanged by it, could not hold myself apart from the emotional currents that swirled through this house. I had married Adrian to save his name, had accepted his ring and his title in exchange for security and survival. But somewhere in the midst of all this pretense and posturing, I was beginning to care, truly care, about what happened to him and to Isabel. And that caring, I suspected, was going to complicate everything in ways I could not yet foresee. As I finally drifted off to sleep, I found myself wondering not whether my heart would remain untouched, but whether I had any hope of protecting it at all. The autumn deepened into early winter, and with it came a subtle but unmistakable shift in the atmosphere of Hargrave Manor. The change was not dramatic, not the sort of thing that could be easily named or pointed to, but it was there nonetheless, threading through the daily rhythms of our lives like a melody played too softly to be fully heard. Adrian and I continued our careful dance of proximity and distance, but the edges had softened somehow, the hostility replaced by something that felt almost like companionship. We took breakfast together each morning, and while he still read his correspondence, he began to ask me questions about my plans for the day, to share small observations about the estate or the weather. They were trivial exchanges, meaningless on their surface, but they represented a thawing, a willingness to acknowledge that we were more than just strangers bound by legal obligation. Isabel blossomed under this new routine like a flower finally given proper light and water. Our daily walks in the garden had become sacred to both of us, a time when she could shed the careful composure expected of her and simply run and laugh and be young. She showed me her favorite hiding spots among the hedges, the tree where birds nested in spring, the bench where she had once sat with her mother on a summer evening. She began to talk more freely, to share her thoughts and fears and small joys with an openness that broke my heart even as it filled it. She asked me endless questions about my life before the manor, about sewing and fabrics, and the world beyond these walls. I answered as honestly as I could, trying to give her a broader view of life than the narrow aristocratic perspective she had been taught. One afternoon, as we sat together in my sitting room working on a new dress for her doll, Isabel asked me a question that caught me completely off guard. She wanted to know if I loved her father, if that was why I had married him. I felt my hands still on the fabric I was holding, felt my breath catch in my throat. I looked at this child with her innocent eyes and her need for simple answers in a world that offered none, and I struggled to find words that would be both truthful and kind. I told her that I had married her father because he needed help, and because I needed a home, and because sometimes grown-ups make arrangements that are different from the romantic stories in books. I told her that love was complicated, that it could grow slowly over time rather than striking like lightning, and that I cared very much about her and about making our family work. She considered this answer with the seriousness she brought to everything, her small brow furrowed in concentration. Then she told me, her voice barely above a whisper, that she was glad I had come, that she had been very lonely before, and that she hoped I would stay. I pulled her close then, holding her against me, feeling her thin frame and the rapid beat of her heart. I promised her that I would stay, that she did not need to worry about being left alone again. I meant it with every fiber of my being, even as I wondered what right I had to make such promises, what claim I truly had to permanence in this household. But in that moment, with Isabel's trust warming me like summer sun, I could not imagine being anywhere else. That evening, there was to be a dinner party, the first social event since our marriage. Adrian had informed me a week prior that we would be entertaining several neighboring families, that it was time to present me formally to local society and begin the work of rehabilitating the family's reputation. I had dreaded the occasion since he mentioned it, knowing that I would be scrutinized and judged, that these people would see immediately that I did not belong in their world. But there was no avoiding it, no way to refuse without undermining the entire purpose of our arrangement. So I dressed in the finest gown from the wardrobe that had been assembled for me, a deep blue silk that brought out the color of my eyes, and I steeled myself for the ordeal ahead. Adrian came to my chambers before the guests arrived, something he had never done before. He stood in my doorway, resplendent in his evening clothes, and for a moment he simply looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then he stepped into the room and withdrew a velvet box from his pocket. He told me that as my husband, it was his responsibility to ensure I was properly attired, and that I would need jewelry appropriate to my station. He opened the box to reveal a sapphire necklace of breathtaking beauty, the stones deep and luminous against their platinum setting. He moved behind me to fasten it around my neck, and I felt his fingers brush against my skin, warm and surprisingly gentle. I watched in the mirror as he secured the clasp, saw the way his face was reflected beside mine, and I felt something shift inside me, some awareness of him as a man rather than merely an obligation. He met my eyes in the mirror, and for a long moment we simply looked at each other, the air between us charged with something I could not name. Then he stepped back, breaking the spell, and told me in his formal voice that the necklace had belonged to his grandmother, that it should be worn by the Duchess of Hargrave, and that it suited me. I touched the stones at my throat, feeling their cool weight, and thanked him quietly. He nodded and left the room, but I remained standing there for several minutes after he was gone, my fingers on the necklace, my reflection staring back at me with confusion and wonder in her eyes. The dinner party was exactly as difficult as I had anticipated, perhaps more so. The guests arrived in their fine carriages, ladies dripping with jewels and gentlemen sporting their medals and honors, all of them burning with curiosity about the mysterious new Duchess. I stood beside Adrian in the receiving line, my hand resting lightly on his arm, and I smiled and greeted each guest with all the grace I could muster. I saw the surprise in their faces when they looked at me, the quick assessment and the barely concealed speculation. Who was this woman? Where had she come from? What possible reason could the Duke of Hargrave have for marrying someone so obviously beneath him? The questions hung in the air unspoken, but their weight was palpable. Dinner was an exercise in endurance. I was seated at the far end of the table from Adrian, surrounded by ladies who peppered me with questions disguised as polite conversation. They asked about my family, my education, where I had been presented at court. Each question was a trap, designed to expose my humble origins and confirm their suspicions. I answered as truthfully as I dared, admitting that I had no titled relations, that my education had been practical rather than ornamental, that I had not been presented because I had not moved in those circles. I saw the glances they exchanged, the satisfied smirks that said they had been right all along. This woman was nothing, nobody, utterly unsuitable for the position she now occupied. But I refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. I kept my head high, my voice steady, my manners impeccable. When Lady Pemberton made a cutting remark about how unusual it was for a duke to marry outside his class, I smiled sweetly and told her that I supposed true nobility lay in character rather than accident of birth, and that my husband had been wise enough to recognize that distinction. When another lady asked how I was managing the complexities of running such a grand household, I told her that I found the work deeply fulfilling, that I took pride in creating beauty and order, much as I had in my previous occupation. I let them know, without quite saying it directly, that I was not ashamed of who I had been or where I had come from, and that their judgment meant less to me than they imagined. I glanced down the table at Adrian several times during the meal and found him watching me, his expression impossible to read. I wondered what he was thinking, whether he was regretting his choice, whether he was mortified by my obvious inadequacy. But when our eyes met, he did something that shocked me. He raised his glass slightly in my direction, the gesture so subtle that no one else would have noticed, but unmistakable to me. It was acknowledgement, perhaps even approval, and it gave me the strength to continue smiling and parrying the questions that came at me like arrows. After dinner, the ladies withdrew to the drawing room while the gentlemen remained behind with their port and cigars. This was, if anything, worse than the dinner itself. Without the buffer of mixed company, the women felt free to speak more openly, their questions becoming sharper, their implications more direct. Lady Ashworth, a formidable matron with silver hair and piercing eyes, asked me point-blank how I had come to meet the Duke, as surely we did not move in the same social spheres. I met her gaze steadily and told her that I had worked at Hargrave Manor, that the Duke had come to know me through my service to his household, and that he had recognized qualities in me that he valued. The room fell silent at this admission, the ladies exchanging looks of shock and something like vindication. Lady Ashworth smiled then, a thin, cold smile, and told me how refreshing it was to meet someone so forthright about their origins. She said that in her day such misalliances were unheard of, that the aristocracy maintained standards that ensured the quality of their bloodlines. She said that of course everyone understood that the Duke had been through difficult times, that his first wife's behavior had been scandalous, and that perhaps in his grief and confusion he had made choices he might not otherwise have made. The implication was clear. I was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, a temporary embarrassment that would eventually be corrected. I felt anger rise in me then, hot and fierce, but I forced it down. I would not give these women the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. Instead, I told Lady Ashworth that I was grateful for her concern, but that the Duke seemed quite satisfied with his choice, as did his daughter, who had benefited greatly from having a mother figure who actually spent time with her and cared for her well-being. I said that perhaps the old standards she spoke of were not as beneficial as she imagined, given how many titled ladies seem to produce miserable, neglected children, despite their impeccable bloodlines. I said it sweetly, with a smile, but the barb struck home. I saw Lady Ashworth's face redden, saw the other ladies shift uncomfortably in their seats. The evening could not end soon enough. When the gentlemen finally rejoined us and the guests began to take their leave, I stood beside Adrian once more, playing my role with all the grace I could summon. As the last carriage rolled away down the drive, I felt exhaustion wash over me like a wave. Adrian dismissed the servants and we stood alone in the entrance hall, the silence after the noise of the party almost deafening. I expected him to retire immediately, to disappear to his study or his chambers as he usually did. But instead, he turned to me and asked if I would join him in the library for a brandy. I followed him there, too tired to question or refuse. He poured 2 glasses and handed one to me, then gestured for me to sit. We sank into the leather chairs by the fire, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. I sipped the brandy, feeling it burn its way down my throat, warming me from the inside. Adrian looked at me over the rim of his glass, and I saw something in his expression that I had not seen before. It might have been respect, or gratitude, or simply acknowledgement that I had endured something difficult and had done so with dignity. He told me that I had handled the evening well, that he knew it could not have been easy to face such scrutiny and judgment. He said that he had heard some of what the ladies had said in the drawing room, that Lady Ashworth's son had been foolish enough to repeat his mother's comments within Adrian's hearing. He told me that he had informed Lord Ashworth in no uncertain terms that any further disrespect toward his wife would result in social consequences that family could ill afford. I looked at him in surprise, not having expected him to defend me, much less to do so with such force. He had seemed so distant during the party, so separate from me, and yet he had been aware of what was happening, had taken steps to protect me from further harm. I thanked him quietly, not trusting myself to say more. He waved away my gratitude and told me that it was his responsibility to protect his wife's dignity, that he would not tolerate society treating me as an object of mockery, But then he said something that went beyond duty or responsibility. He said that I had shown remarkable courage and grace under fire, that I had refused to be diminished by their petty cruelties, and that he admired that quality in me. He said it simply, without embellishment, but the words struck me with unexpected force. Adrian, who rarely offered praise to anyone, who maintained such rigid control over his emotions, was telling me that he admired me. I felt something warm unfurl in my chest, something dangerous and sweet. We talked then, really talked, in a way we never had before. He asked me about my life before Hargrave Manor, about my mother and my childhood, about what it had been like to work with my hands and create beautiful things for others. I told him stories I had not shared with anyone, about the long hours in the sewing room, about the satisfaction of completing a difficult piece, about the dreams I had harbored and let die as I grew older and more pragmatic. He listened intently, his gray eyes focused on my face, and I had the strange sensation that he was truly seeing me for the first time, not as a convenient solution to his problems, but as a person with my own history and complexity. In turn, he spoke more openly than he ever had about his own life, about the weight of expectations that had been placed on him from birth, about his father's death when he was barely 20 and the sudden responsibility of the dukedom. He told me about his courtship with Catherine, how he had tried to be a good husband according to the standards he had been taught, providing material comfort and social position, but never understanding that she needed something more. He spoke of his failure without self-pity, simply as fact, and I began to understand that beneath his cold exterior was a man who had been taught that emotions were weaknesses, that vulnerability was dangerous, that the only safety lay in control and distance. The hours slipped past as we sat there by the fire, the brandy warming us, the darkness outside pressing against the windows. At some point, Adrian rose to add more wood to the fire, and when he returned to his chair, he sat closer to me than he had been before. Not touching, not intimate, but near enough that I could feel his presence like heat from a flame. We fell into a comfortable silence, and I found myself studying his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the silver threading through his dark hair, the weariness etched around his eyes. He was handsome, I realized, though I had never let myself think of him that way before. More than that, he was lonely as I was, as lonely as Isabel was. We were three isolated souls living under one roof, each locked in our own prisons, unable or unwilling to reach out to one another. Adrian turned his head then and caught me looking at him. Our eyes met and held, and I saw something kindle in his gaze, something that made my breath catch and my heart begin to race. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull away if I wished, and touched my face, his fingers gentle against my cheek. It was the first time he had touched me with tenderness rather than formality or anger, and the sensation went through me like lightning. He traced the line of my jaw, his thumb brushing across my lower lip, and I saw his expression shift, saw the careful control begin to slip. He leaned toward me, and I knew he was going to kiss me, knew I should pull away, should remind him of the terms we had agreed upon. But I did not pull away. I remained perfectly still, my heart pounding, waiting. The kiss, when it came, was nothing like I had imagined. It was not forceful or demanding, not the kiss of a man claiming his property. It was gentle, questioning, almost hesitant, as though he were offering rather than taking. His lips were warm against mine, his hand still cradling my face, and I felt something inside me break open, some wall I had built to protect myself from exactly this moment. I kissed him back, my hand coming up to rest against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath my palm. For that suspended moment, we were not Duke and Seamstress, not two people bound by convenience and necessity. We were simply man and woman, reaching for connection in the darkness. He pulled back first, breaking the kiss, his hand falling away from my face. I saw confusion in his eyes, and something that might have been fear. He stood abruptly, putting distance between us, and I saw him rebuild his walls in real time, saw the warmth drain from his expression as he reasserted control. He told me, his voice rough, that he should not have done that it was not part of our agreement, that he had allowed the brandy and the late hour to cloud his judgment. He apologized stiffly, formally, and I felt the sting of his retreat like a physical blow. He left the library without waiting for my response, his footsteps echoing in the empty halls. And I sat there alone by the dying fire with my fingers pressed to my lips and tears threatening to fall. I did not understand what had just happened, could not make sense of the tumult of emotions churning inside me. I had told myself that this was a marriage of convenience, that I would maintain my independence and dignity, that I would not allow myself to become entangled in the complications of feeling. But in the space of a single kiss, all of those careful resolutions had crumbled to dust. I could not deny any more that I was attracted to Adrian, that something in me responded to him despite all the reasons it should not. I could not pretend that his coldness did not hurt me, that his retreat after that moment of genuine connection had not wounded me deeply. I had been guarding my heart so carefully, but I was beginning to fear it was already too late. I made my way to my chambers eventually, moving through the dark house like a ghost. My maid was waiting to help me undress, and she chattered cheerfully about the dinner party as she unfastened the buttons of my gown and removed the sapphire necklace. I responded mechanically, not really hearing her words, my mind still in the library with Adrian. When I was finally alone, I climbed into bed and lay staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the evening, trying to understand what it all meant. The kiss had been brief, barely more than a brush of lips, but it had shaken something loose inside me, had revealed feelings I had been desperately trying to ignore. The next morning, Adrian was not at breakfast. Mrs. Dawson informed me that he had risen early and ridden out to inspect the tenant farms, that he would likely be gone most of the day. I knew this was deliberate, that he was avoiding me, putting distance between us after the intimacy of the previous night. I felt the hurt of it, the rejection, but I also felt a stirring of anger. He had kissed me, had reached for me first, and now he was running away rather than facing what had happened between us. I would not chase him, would not beg for his attention or his affection, but I would not pretend that nothing had changed either. I spent the day with Isabel as usual, and her presence was a balm to my troubled heart. We worked on her lessons together, walked in the gardens despite the cold wind, and sat by the fire in my sitting room reading from a book of fairy tales. She curled against my side, her small body warm and trusting, and I felt a fierce surge of love for this child who had claimed a place in my heart so completely. Whatever happened between Adrian and me, whatever the future held, I would not abandon Isabel. She was the one pure, uncomplicated good to come from this strange marriage, and I would protect her with everything I had. That evening, Adrian returned just as dinner was being served. He came to the dining room still wearing his riding clothes, mud spattering his boots, his face windburned from hours in the cold. He apologized for his tardiness and took his seat across from me. We ate in silence, the tension between us thick enough to cut with a knife. The servants moved around us with careful neutrality, pretending not to notice the awkwardness. When the meal was finished and we were alone, Adrian finally spoke. He asked me stiffly if Isabel had behaved well, if I had found everything I needed, if the household was running smoothly. Safe questions, impersonal questions, questions designed to avoid any reference to what had passed between us. I set down my wine glass with more force than necessary and told him that we needed to talk about what happened in the library. I saw him tense, saw him prepare to retreat again, but I did not give him the chance. I told him that he could not kiss me and then pretend it never happened, that we were supposed to be adults capable of honest communication, that this avoidance and awkwardness served neither of us. I told him that I understood this was not what he had planned, that it complicated our arrangement in ways that made him uncomfortable, but that we needed to address it rather than hiding from it. I spoke firmly, clearly, refusing to be dismissed or deflected. Adrian looked at me across the table, and I saw warring emotions in his face. Anger, fear, confusion, and beneath it all, desire. He told me that he had crossed a line, that he had violated the terms of our agreement, and that it would not happen again. He said that he had let his guard down, had allowed himself to feel things that were dangerous and unwise, and that he regretted it. But even as he said the words, I could see the lie in them, could see that he did not truly regret the kiss itself, but rather the vulnerability it had revealed. He was not angry at me. He was angry at himself for wanting something he had sworn not to want, for feeling something he had promised himself never to feel again. I told him then, my voice soft but steady, that I did not regret the kiss, that I would not apologize for responding to him, that there was nothing shameful in two people finding comfort and connection in each other. I told him that I understood he had been hurt, that Catherine's betrayal had taught him to fear intimacy, but that not every woman was Catherine, and not every feeling led to pain. I told him that we could continue as we had been, maintaining our careful distance and our separate lives, but that he should not expect me to pretend I felt nothing, that I had no awareness of him as a man rather than merely a title. I laid it all out between us, raw and honest, and then I waited for his response. He was silent for so long that I thought he would not answer at all. Then he stood and walked to the window, his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. He told me that he did not know how to do this, how to navigate the space between the safe arrangement we had made and the complicated reality of actual feeling. He said that he had spent years building his defenses, had learned to function without the messiness of emotion, and that he did not know if he was capable of changing that pattern. He said that he could not promise me anything beyond what we had already agreed upon, could not guarantee that he would ever be able to give me the warmth or affection that other women might expect from their husbands. But he also admitted, his voice barely above a whisper, that something had shifted for him, that he found himself thinking about me at odd moments, that my presence in his life had become something more than merely convenient. I rose from the table and crossed the room to stand beside him at the window. We looked out at the dark gardens together, our reflections ghostly in the glass. I told him that I did not need promises or guarantees, that I understood the risks and the complications as well as he did. I told him that we could take this slowly, could see what developed between us without forcing it or defining it. I told him that I was not asking him to love me, was not demanding that he transform into someone he was not. I was simply suggesting that we allow ourselves the possibility of something more than the cold arrangement we had begun with. I reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the window frame, a gentle connection, and I felt him tense and then slowly relax. He turned to look at me then, really look at me, and I saw his walls crumble just a little more. He told me that he would try, that he could not promise success, but that he would try to be more open, more present, more willing to let me in. He said it gravely, as though making a vow, and I understood that for a man like Adrian, this was no small concession. This was an act of courage, a step into territory that terrified him. I squeezed his hand gently and told him that trying was enough, that I asked nothing more. We stood there together in the quiet dining room, the candles burning low, and something fragile and precious took shape between us. Something neither of us quite dared to name, but both of us recognized nonetheless. The weeks that followed our conversation in the dining room brought changes both subtle and profound to the fabric of our daily lives. Adrian did not transform overnight into the warm, attentive husband of romantic fantasies, nor did I expect him to. But he tried, as he had promised, and the effort itself was a gift I had not known I needed. He began joining Isabel and me on our afternoon walks when his schedule permitted, his tall figure striding beside us through the frost-touched gardens, while his daughter chattered about everything and nothing. At first, he was stiff and formal, unsure how to engage with a child beyond issuing instructions or corrections. But I watched him slowly learn to listen, to ask questions, to notice the small things that delighted Isabel, the smooth pebbles and interesting leaves and birds that called from the bare branches. One afternoon, as we stood by the lake watching the winter sun paint the water gold, Isabel asked her father if he remembered bringing her here when she was very small, before her mother died. I saw Adrian freeze, saw the walls start to rise in his eyes, and I held my breath waiting for him to retreat into coldness, as he always had when Catherine was mentioned. But instead, after a long pause, he knelt down to Isabel's level and told her that he did remember, that she had been fascinated by the ducks and had insisted on naming each one. He described how she had tried to feed them bread from her tiny hands, how she had laughed when they waddled toward her. Isabel's face lit up with wonder at this glimpse of a father she had not known existed, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion at the sight of them together, really together, for perhaps the first time. That evening, after Isabel had been put to bed, Adrian came to my sitting room rather than retreating to his study, as had been his habit. He knocked softly and asked if he might join me, and I set aside the embroidery I had been working on and welcomed him in. He settled into the chair across from mine, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling between us. Then he told me that he had been thinking about what I said, about Isabel needing love and not just protection. He said that watching me with his daughter had shown him how much he had been withholding from her, how his fear of vulnerability had translated into emotional abandonment. He said it was difficult for him to change patterns that had been ingrained for so long, but that he was beginning to see the cost of his rigidity. I told him gently that I had seen the change already, that his effort to connect with Isabel was not going unnoticed, that the small moments mattered more than grand gestures. I told him that healing did not happen all at once, that it was built slowly through consistent presence and care. He looked at me with an expression that held something like gratitude, and then he did something that surprised me. He asked me to tell him more about my mother, about the woman who had raised me with so little material wealth but such obvious love. I found myself speaking of memories I rarely revisited, of my mother's gentle hands and her quiet strength, of the way she had sung while she worked, and how she had always found something to be grateful for despite our poverty. As I spoke, I saw Adrian listening with an intensity that made me feel truly seen. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he told me that I was fortunate to have had such a mother, that the love she had given me had shaped me into someone who knew how to love others well. He said it simply, as a statement of fact, but I heard beneath it an acknowledgement of his own loss, his own lack. His mother had died when he was young, and his father had been a distant, demanding figure more concerned with duty than affection. Adrian had been raised by tutors and servants, taught to suppress emotion and prize control above all else. No wonder he struggled so profoundly with intimacy and tenderness. He had never been shown how. Our evenings together became a regular occurrence after that night. Sometimes we talked, sharing pieces of our pasts and our thoughts about the present. Sometimes we simply sat together in companionable silence, me with my needlework and him with a book or his correspondence. There was comfort in these quiet hours, a sense of partnership that had nothing to do with the terms of our original agreement. I found myself looking forward to the sound of his knock on my door, to the sight of him settling into his chair, to the warmth of his presence filling the space. And I could see that he looked forward to it too, that these evenings had become as necessary to him as they were to me. But the outside world did not allow us to remain sequestered in our growing cocoon of domestic peace. The gossip from our dinner party had spread through the county like wildfire, and invitations began arriving from families eager to assess the scandalous new duchess for themselves. Adrian told me that we needed to accept some of these invitations, that continued social engagement was necessary to achieve the respectability he had married me to secure. I agreed, though I dreaded the prospect of more encounters like the one with Lady Ashworth and her circle of judgmental companions. But I also understood that this was part of my duty, part of what I had agreed to when I accepted Adrian's proposal. The first of these social obligations was a ball at the home of Lord and Lady Thornbury, one of the most prominent families in the region. The invitation specified that it was a grand affair to celebrate their daughter's engagement, and that attendance was expected from all families of consequence. Adrian's jaw tightened when he read the invitation, and he told me that Lord Thornbury had been a particular friend of his late wife's family, that Catherine had been close to Lady Thornbury before her death. I understood the subtext. This would not be a friendly audience. These people had known Catherine, had probably taken her side in whatever marital difficulties she and Adrian had experienced, and they would view me as an interloper at best and an opportunist at worst. The week before the ball, Adrian surprised me by asking if I would allow him to take me to London for a few days to select a proper gown for the occasion. He said that we would be under intense scrutiny at the Thornbury ball, and that it was important I be dressed in a manner that would command respect and silence critics. I agreed, both touched by his consideration and anxious about the prospect of my first visit to London as the Duchess of Hargrave. We left Isabel in the capable hands of her governess, promising to bring her back something special, and set out on the journey in Adrian's well-appointed carriage. London overwhelmed me with its noise and crowds and sheer scale. I had never been to the city before, had lived my entire life in small towns and country houses, and the crush of humanity and commerce was both exhilarating and frightening. Adrian had taken rooms at a fashionable hotel, and he escorted me to the most exclusive modiste in Mayfair, a Frenchwoman named Madame Beaumont, who dressed all the most important ladies of society. She assessed me with sharp eyes, circling me like a general surveying troops, and then she smiled and told Adrian that I had excellent bone structure and would wear her creations beautifully. I was measured and pinned and draped with fabrics for what felt like hours, while Madame Beaumont and her assistants debated colors and cuts and embellishments. Adrian sat in a chair watching the proceedings, and when they presented me in various sample gowns for his approval, I saw something in his eyes that made my cheeks flush. He was looking at me not as a problem to be solved or a duty to be discharged, but as a woman he found attractive. When they showed me in a gown of deep emerald silk that brought out the auburn highlights in my brown hair and made my eyes look like sapphires, he stood up and came closer, his gaze traveling over me with an intensity that made my breath catch. He told Madame Beaumont that the green gown would do perfectly, and that she should spare no expense in making it exquisite. Then he dismissed the modiste and her assistants, asking for a moment alone with me. When they had gone, he reached out and touched the silk at my shoulder, his fingers gentle against the fabric. He told me that I looked beautiful, that no one at the Thornbury ball would be able to claim I did not belong among them. But then he said something more, something that went beyond mere aesthetics. He said that the gown was just silk and thread, that what truly made me beautiful was the strength and dignity I carried, the kindness I showed to Isabel, the courage I had demonstrated in facing down society's cruelty. He said these things looking directly into my eyes, and I saw in his face an openness I had never seen before. I thanked him quietly, not trusting my voice to remain steady if I said more. He held my gaze for a long moment, and I thought he might kiss me again, as he had in the library weeks before. But he stepped back instead, clearing his throat, and told me he would wait outside while I changed back into my day dress. The moment passed, but the warmth of it lingered, settling into my bones like good wine. We spent 2 more days in London, and they were some of the happiest of my life. Adrian showed me the city like a proud guardian introducing a beloved ward to his domain. We visited museums and galleries, walked through parks, attended a concert at the Royal Opera House. He bought me gloves and a new winter cloak and a hat with ostrich feathers that made me laugh at my own reflection. We dined at elegant restaurants, and he pointed out members of the aristocracy and shared gossip about their various scandals and eccentricities. For those brief days, we existed outside the constraints of Hargrave Manor and its ghosts. And I caught a glimpse of who Adrian might have been if circumstances had been different, if he had not been so wounded by his first marriage. On our last evening in London, as we walked back to the hotel through streets lit by gas lamps, Adrian took my hand and tucked it into the crook of his arm. It was a simple gesture, the sort of thing any husband might do for his wife, but between us it felt momentous. We walked in comfortable silence, and I felt utterly content, utterly at peace, in a way I had not felt since I was a child. When we reached the hotel, Adrian walked me to the door of my room, and we stood there in the dimly lit corridor, neither of us quite ready to say goodnight. He touched my cheek with his fingertips, his eyes searching mine, and I saw longing there, and hesitation, and something that might have been love struggling to take shape. I rose on my toes and kissed him, taking the initiative this time, refusing to let his fear and his doubts rob us of this moment. He made a soft sound of surprise, and then surrender, his arms coming around me, pulling me close against him. The kiss deepened, became something hungry and desperate, years of loneliness and isolation pouring out of both of us into this connection. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard, and I saw in Adrian's face a war between desire and discipline, between what he wanted and what he thought he should allow himself to have. I told him softly that I wanted him, that I was his wife in truth, not just in name, and that we did not need to continue denying ourselves something we both clearly desired. I told him that this was not a betrayal of our original agreement, but rather an evolution of it, a natural progression of the genuine affection that had grown between us. I said it clearly, giving him permission to want me, to have me, removing the barrier of his own guilt and his conviction that desire was somehow shameful or dangerous. I watched the conflict play out across his features, and then I saw him make his choice. He opened the door to my room and drew me inside, closing it quietly behind us. We came together with all the pent-up need of months of careful distance, of nights lying alone in our separate chambers, wondering what the other was thinking and feeling. He was gentle despite his urgency, his hands trembling slightly as he helped me out of my gown, as he traced the curves of my body with something like reverence. I had never been with a man before, had saved myself in the naive hope that someday I might marry for love, and I was nervous, uncertain. But Adrian was patient, whispering reassurances, taking his time, making sure I felt safe and cherished even as passion built between us like a gathering storm. What passed between us that night was more than physical joining, though that was transformative enough. It was a breaking down of walls, a merging of two lonely souls who had found unexpected solace in each other's arms. Afterward, we lay tangled together in the bed, my head resting on his chest, his fingers trailing through my hair, and I felt a completeness I had never known. Adrian held me close and told me things he had never said to anyone, confessions about his fears and his failures, about the guilt he carried over Catherine's unhappiness and death, about his terror that he would never be capable of genuine connection. I listened and offered no judgment, only understanding, and I felt him relax in my arms, felt some of the tension he carried constantly begin to ease. I told him my own truths, about the loneliness of my life before Hargrave Manor, about the way I had learned to expect nothing and hope for nothing, about how frightened I had been when he first proposed, and how much my feelings had changed. I told him that I had not planned to fall in love with him, had actively resisted it, but that I could not deny any more what I felt. The words hung in the air between us, and I felt him go still, felt his heartbeat quicken beneath my ear. He did not say the words back, and I had not expected him to. Love was still too frightening for him to name, still too dangerous to claim. But he held me tighter, pressed his lips to my hair, and I felt in his embrace a response that needed no words. We returned to Hargrave Manor changed, bound together in ways that went far beyond our original contract. We shared a bed now, though we kept separate chambers for the sake of propriety and Isabel's understanding. Adrian was more openly affectionate with me, taking my hand at dinner, kissing my cheek when he left for his morning rides, seeking me out during the day to share some thought or observation. The staff noticed, of course, and I saw the speculation in their eyes, the whispered conversations that ceased when I entered a room. But I did not care what they thought. For the first time in my life, I was genuinely happy, and no amount of gossip could diminish that joy. Isabel certainly noticed the change in her father and in our household dynamics. She asked me one afternoon whether Papa was happier now, whether something good had happened. I told her truthfully that I thought he was happier, that sometimes people needed time to learn how to be happy, and that her father was learning. She seemed satisfied with this answer, and then announced with great solemnity that she was happy too, that having a real family was better than she had imagined. I hugged her close, this precious child who had so thoroughly captured my heart, and I thought about how strangely life worked, how the marriage I had entered with such resignation had become the source of my greatest joy. But our happiness existed in a fragile bubble, and I should have known it could not last undisturbed. The Thornberry ball approached, and with it came a return of Adrian's tension and worry. He told me that he had received a letter from Lady Thornberry that troubled him, though he would not specify why. He said only that we needed to be especially careful at the ball, that there were forces at work that wished to see him brought low and his family destroyed. I did not fully understand what he meant, but I could see the old coldness trying to reassert itself in his face, the walls beginning to rebuild now that we were returning to the world that had hurt him so badly. The night of the ball arrived, and I dressed in the emerald gown that Madame Beaumont had created, a masterpiece of silk and lace that transformed me into someone I barely recognized. Adrian came to my chambers to collect me, and when he saw me fully dressed with my hair arranged in an elaborate style and the sapphire necklace at my throat, he stopped in the doorway and simply stared. I saw desire in his eyes, yes, but also pride and something fierce and protective. He told me that I looked magnificent, that I would be the most beautiful woman at the ball, and that he was honored to have me as his wife. He said it with such sincerity that tears pricked at my eyes, and I had to blink them back to preserve my carefully applied cosmetics. We arrived at Thornberry House fashionably late, and I felt my stomach clench with anxiety as we entered the blazing light and noise of the ballroom. It was even grander than I had imagined, with crystal chandeliers and mirrored walls and hundreds of guests in their finest attire. All eyes turned toward us as we were announced, and I felt the weight of their scrutiny like a physical pressure. But I kept my head high, my hand resting lightly on Adrian's arm, and I smiled as though I had every right to be there, as though their judgment meant nothing to me. I was the Duchess of Hargrave, and I would not be cowed. Lord and Lady Thornberry greeted us with cool politeness, their smiles not reaching their eyes. Lady Thornberry looked me over from head to toe, her expression suggesting she found me wanting despite my fine gown and jewels. She made several pointed comments about how different I was from dear Catherine, how unusual it was to see such a mismatched couple, how she hoped I was not finding the demands of my new position too overwhelming. I responded with grace, thanking her for her concern, and assuring her that I was managing quite well. But I felt Adrian tense beside me, felt his anger at the veiled insults being directed my way. We moved into the ballroom proper, and Adrian led me onto the dance floor for the first waltz. I had been taught the steps by a patient dancing master Adrian had hired for me, but I was still nervous about performing in front of so many critical eyes. Adrian sensed my anxiety and pulled me closer than was strictly proper, his hand firm at my waist, his eyes locked on mine. He told me quietly to ignore everyone else, to focus only on him, to let him guide me. I did as he said, losing myself in the movement and in his steady presence, and I forgot to be afraid. We moved together with surprising grace, and I saw surprise register on the faces of those watching, saw them reassessing their assumptions about the awkward seamstress who had somehow ensnared a duke. When the dance ended, we were immediately surrounded by people eager to speak with Adrian and to examine me more closely. I smiled and answered questions and endured scrutiny, all while maintaining the serene composure I had learned to project. Several gentlemen asked me to dance, and Adrian nodded his permission, though I saw jealousy flash in his eyes when a particularly handsome young lord led me onto the floor. The evening progressed in a whirl of music and conversation and barely concealed hostility, and I began to think we might survive it without incident. But then Lady Thornberry took the floor for an announcement, and I felt a cold dread settle in my stomach. She called for attention, her voice ringing out over the assembled crowd, and she said that she had a special presentation to make this evening. She spoke about the importance of truth and honor, about how society must protect itself from those who would deceive and manipulate for personal gain. She said that it was her sad duty to reveal information that had recently come to her attention, information that concerned someone present at the ball. My heart began to race, and I looked at Adrian, saw his face go white, saw him understand something I did not yet grasp. Lady Thornberry produced a packet of letters, yellowed with age, tied with a faded ribbon. She announced that these were letters written by Lady Catherine Hargrave before her death, letters that revealed the truth about her marriage and about the circumstances of her daughter's birth. She began to read from one of the letters, Catherine's voice brought back from the grave to accuse and condemn. The letter spoke of Adrian's coldness and cruelty, of how he had refused to love her, of how she had sought comfort in the arms of another man because her husband would not touch her. It spoke of Isabel, of how the child was proof of Catherine's betrayal, of how Adrian knew the truth and kept Isabel anyway out of pride and stubbornness. The ballroom erupted in shocked murmurs and gasps. I stood frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. I looked at Adrian and saw not denial, but devastation, saw that this revelation, true or false, was destroying him before my eyes. Lady Thornberry continued reading, her voice dripping with false sympathy. And with each word, the crowd turned more hostile toward Adrian, more scandalized by what they were hearing. I wanted to scream, to snatch the letters and destroy them, to protect Adrian and Isabel from this public humiliation. But I was paralyzed, unable to move or speak, watching helplessly as everything we had built together crumbled around us. Adrian finally found his voice and demanded to know where Lady Thornberry had obtained those letters, whether she had verification of their authenticity. She smiled coldly and told him that they had been provided to her by Catherine's former maid, a woman who had kept them all these years and finally decided the truth should be known. She said that the letters were genuine, written in Catherine's own hand, and that there could be no doubt of their veracity. She said that while she sympathized with Adrian's position, the public deserved to know the truth about the Hargrave family, especially given his recent marriage to someone so clearly beneath his station. I felt Adrian's hand grip mine so tightly it hurt, felt him trembling with rage and shame. And then I saw him make a decision, saw him draw himself up to his full height and face the crowd with all the dignity of his rank and breeding. He told them that yes, Catherine had been unhappy in their marriage, that he had failed her as a husband in many ways. He said that her letters revealed painful truths about their relationship, truths he did not deny. But he also said that Isabel was his daughter in every way that mattered, that regardless of biology, she was a Hargrave and she would be treated as such. He said that his current marriage was none of their business, that Eleanor had brought honor and love to his household, and that anyone who questioned her worthiness could direct their concerns to him personally. The crowd was silent, shocked by this admission, by Adrian's refusal to deny or defend or dissemble. Then someone laughed, a cruel sound that rippled through the ballroom like poison. Others joined in, and I saw in their faces the savage joy of aristocrats witnessing one of their own brought low. Lady Thornberry stood triumphant, having achieved exactly what she set out to do. Adrian took my arm and told me we were leaving, and we made our way through the crowd toward the exit. People moved aside to let us pass, their expressions ranging from pity to contempt to malicious satisfaction. I kept my head high, refused to let them see how completely they had destroyed me. We rode home in silence, the carriage rattling through the dark countryside. Adrian sat across from me. His face turned to the window, his body rigid with contained emotion. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that it would be all right, but I could not find the words. When we finally arrived at Hargrave Manor, he handed me down from the carriage without meeting my eyes and told me he needed to be alone. He walked away toward his study, and I stood in the entrance hall watching him go, feeling more helpless and lost than I had felt since the day I agreed to marry him. Everything had changed again, and I did not know if what we had built together was strong enough to survive this new assault. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my bed, listening to the house settle around me, wondering if Adrian was similarly awake in his chambers, wondering what he was thinking, what he was feeling, whether the fragile bond we had built was already broken beyond repair. I kept seeing Lady Thornberry's triumphant face, kept hearing Catherine's words read aloud to that cruel audience, kept feeling the weight of all those judging eyes upon us. But most of all, I kept thinking about Isabel, about that innocent child sleeping peacefully upstairs, unaware that her world had just been torn apart by revelations she was too young to understand. When dawn finally came, I rose and dressed mechanically, my hands moving through familiar motions while my mind remained numb with shock and worry. I went down to breakfast expecting to find Adrian already gone, fled to some distant corner of the estate to lick his wounds in private. But instead, I found him sitting at the table, still wearing evening clothes that were now rumpled and stained, his face haggard with exhaustion. A bottle of whiskey sat before him, half empty, and I realized he had spent the night drinking alone in his study rather than sleeping. He looked up when I entered, and I saw such desolation in his eyes that it took my breath away. I sat down beside him, rather than across from him, breaking our usual arrangement, and I took his hand in mine. It was cold, and his fingers gripped mine with desperate strength. I told him that whatever happened next, we would face it together, that he was not alone in this. He laughed, a bitter sound without humor, and told me that I should leave him, that I had every right to annul our marriage and return to whatever life I might build for myself away from this scandal. He said that he had dragged me into his mess, had used me as a shield against society's judgment, and that the least he could do now was release me from the obligation. He said it while still holding my hand, while his eyes pleaded with me to contradict him, and I understood that he was testing me, needing to know if I would abandon him now that his worst fears had been realized. I told him firmly that I had no intention of leaving him or Isabel, that I had made vows that meant something to me even if they had been entered into under unusual circumstances, and that I loved him too much to run away at the first real difficulty. I said the words plainly, without artifice or qualification, making sure he heard and understood. I loved him. Despite everything, despite the scandal and the humiliation and the uncertainty of what came next, I loved this complicated, wounded man who had somehow captured my heart. I saw shock register on his face, saw tears spring to his eyes, though he blinked them back fiercely. He pulled me close then, burying his face in my hair, and I felt his shoulders shake with emotion he could no longer contain. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were red but clearer than they had been. He told me that he did not deserve me, that he had done nothing to earn such loyalty and devotion. But then he said, his voice rough and unsteady, that he loved me too, that he had been falling in love with me for weeks without allowing himself to acknowledge it, that the thought of losing me was more terrifying than any scandal society could devise. He said it like a confession, like something torn from deep inside him, and I saw in his face the cost of this admission. How much courage it took for him to speak these words after years of guarding his heart so carefully. I kissed him then, tasting salt and whiskey and desperation, and I felt something settle into place between us, something solid and unshakable that had not existed before. We were interrupted by Mrs. Dawson, who appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable and anxious. She informed us that several members of the household staff had given notice that morning, unwilling to remain in service to a family tainted by such scandal. She said that Lord Ashworth's butler had sent a message declining our invitation to the hunting party we had planned, and that 2 other families had sent similar regrets. The social consequences of the previous night's revelation were already manifesting, and it was clear that we would be ostracized, cut off from the society that had already viewed me with such suspicion. Adrian thanked Mrs. Dawson curtly and dismissed her, then turned to me with weary resignation. He said that it would get worse before it got better, that we should prepare ourselves for a complete withdrawal of social acceptance. I told him that I had never cared much for society anyway, that I had spent most of my life invisible to the people who now felt entitled to judge me, and that their rejection held no terror for me. But I asked him what this would mean for Isabel, what impact the scandal would have on her future prospects, her ability to marry well, her place in the world she had been born into. Adrian's face darkened, and he told me that this was precisely what he had been trying to prevent by marrying me, that the entire purpose of our arrangement had been to protect Isabel from exactly this kind of damage. He said that Lady Thornbury had succeeded in destroying what he had worked so hard to build, and that Isabel would pay the price for his failures and Catherine's betrayals. I stood and began to pace the room, my mind working furiously. I told Adrian that perhaps we were approaching this from the wrong angle, that we were accepting society's right to judge and condemn when we should be challenging it. I reminded him that Isabel was his daughter in every way that mattered, that he had raised her and loved her and claimed her as his own, and that no letter from beyond the grave could change those fundamental facts. I said that if we retreated and hid, if we acted ashamed or defeated, then we would be confirming all of society's worst assumptions. But if we stood firm, if we refused to be diminished by gossip and speculation, then perhaps we could weather this storm and emerge stronger. Adrian looked at me as though I had lost my mind. He told me that I clearly did not understand how society worked, how unforgiving it could be, how a stain on one's reputation could follow a family for generations. But I cut him off and told him that I understood perfectly well, that I had spent my entire life on the receiving end of society's judgment, and that I had learned something important from that experience. I had learned that other people's opinions only had as much power as you gave them, that dignity and worth came from within rather than from external validation. I told him that we had a choice to make, that we could either surrender to the shame they wanted to impose on us, or we could reject their right to shame us at all. I could see the conflict playing out across his features, the habitual deference to societal expectations warring with the appeal of defiance. Finally, he asked me what exactly I was proposing, what action I thought we should take. I told him that first, we needed to talk to Isabel, to prepare her for what she would inevitably hear, to make sure she knew that she was loved and valued regardless of what anyone else might say. I told him that second, we needed to make a statement, some public gesture that demonstrated our unity and our refusal to be cowed. And third, I said that he needed to track down Catherine's former maid and find out what had really happened with those letters, whether they were authentic or had been fabricated or taken out of context. Adrian listened to my proposals with growing interest, and I saw the strategic mind that had built his fortune and managed his vast estate begin to engage with the problem. He said that talking to Isabel was wise, though he dreaded the conversation more than he had dreaded anything in years. He agreed that some public statement might be necessary, though he was not sure what form it should take, and he said that yes, he should investigate the letter's provenance, that Catherine's maid was a woman named Margaret Fletcher, who had left service shortly after Catherine's death, and whom he had thought had returned to her family in Cornwall. He said he would send men to find her immediately and discover what inducement Lady Thornbury had offered to secure those letters. We went upstairs together to speak with Isabel, and found her in the nursery with her governess, working on her lessons. When she saw us enter together, her face lit up with the innocent joy she had begun to show more frequently in recent weeks. But then she must have seen something in our expressions, because her smile faltered and she asked if something was wrong. Adrian knelt down before her, taking her small hands in his larger ones. and I saw him struggle to find the right words. Finally, he told her gently that there were going to be some difficult days ahead, that people might say unkind things about our family, and that she needed to know the truth, so she would not be confused or frightened by what she heard. He told her, in simple terms she could understand, that her mother had been very unhappy when she was alive, and that she had written letters saying things that were now causing problems for the family. He told her that some people were saying she might not be his real daughter, but that he wanted her to know with absolute certainty that she was his daughter in every way that mattered to him, that he loved her and would always protect her, and that nothing anyone said could change that fundamental truth. Isabel listened with wide eyes, processing this information with the seriousness she brought to everything. Then she asked, her voice small and worried, whether this meant she would have to go away, whether he would send her somewhere else if people said bad things about her. Adrian pulled her into his arms and held her tight, and I saw tears streaming down his face without shame or attempt at concealment. He told her that she would never leave him, that she was his daughter and his heir and the most precious thing in his life, and that he would face down anyone who tried to take her from him or make her feel unwanted. He told her that he was sorry he had not said these things more often, that he had been afraid to show how much he loved her, but that he was done being afraid. Isabel clung to him, and I knelt beside them both, wrapping my arms around them, and we stayed that way for a long time, the three of us locked together against the world's cruelty. When we finally pulled apart, Isabel looked at me with those enormous dark eyes and asked if I was still going to be her mama, if I was going to stay even though people were saying mean things. I told her absolutely, that nothing could make me leave her, that we were a family now, and families stayed together through hard times. She seemed satisfied with this answer and returned to her lessons, though I saw the governess looking troubled and knew that even the most loyal servants would be questioning whether they wanted to remain attached to a household under such a cloud. But I could only deal with one crisis at a time, and the most important thing was that Isabel knew she was loved and safe. Over the next few days, the social consequences of the ball continued to manifest in ways both large and small. Invitations were withdrawn, previously friendly neighbors crossed the street to avoid speaking to us, and the local shops grew suddenly less welcoming when I ventured into the village. But there were also unexpected moments of grace. The vicar came to call and told Adrian privately that he stood with our family, that whatever Catherine's sins might have been, they should not be visited upon an innocent child. Several of the tenant farmers sent messages of support, simple notes expressing their loyalty and their belief that the Duke was a good man who had always treated them fairly. And one afternoon, a carriage arrived bearing Lady Pemberton, the woman whose gown I had once sewn, who embraced me warmly and told me that anyone with eyes could see I was exactly what Adrian and Isabel needed. Adrian's investigators located Margaret Fletcher within a week, and what they discovered was both illuminating and enraging. The letters were genuine, written by Catherine in one of her darker periods, but they had been carefully selected and edited by Lady Thornbury to present the worst possible picture. Margaret revealed that Catherine had written dozens of letters over the years, many of them contradicting the ones that had been read at the ball, many of them expressing genuine affection for Adrian despite their difficulties. She admitted that Lady Thornbury had paid her a substantial sum for the letters and had specifically requested ones that would cause maximum damage to Adrian's reputation. She said she had been desperate, her family in debt, and that she had convinced herself it did not matter since Catherine was dead and could not be hurt by the revelation. Armed with this information, Adrian consulted with his solicitors about potential legal action against Lady Thornbury for defamation and malicious intent. But I argued against this approach, suggesting instead that we use the truth in a different way. I proposed that we host a gathering at Hargrave Manor, invite all the local families whether they came or not, and present a unified front that demonstrated we had nothing to hide and nothing to be ashamed of. I suggested we make Margaret available to tell her story, to reveal the manipulation behind the scandal, and to set the record straight about Catherine's true feelings and circumstances. Adrian was skeptical, worried that such a gathering would simply provide another opportunity for humiliation. But I convinced him that staying silent would only allow the false narrative to harden into accepted truth. We sent out invitations for a reception at Hargrave Manor, carefully worded to suggest that we had important information to share about recent events. To our surprise, nearly everyone accepted, their curiosity apparently overcoming their scruples about associating with scandal. On the evening of the reception, our house blazed with light, and our staff, those who had remained loyal, prepared everything with meticulous care. Adrian and I dressed carefully, me in a gown of subdued elegance and him in impeccable evening clothes, and we prepared to face our accusers with truth and dignity as our only weapons. When the guests arrived, we greeted them with gracious formality, neither apologetic nor defiant, simply present and composed. Once everyone had assembled in the ballroom, Adrian called for attention and began to speak. He thanked everyone for coming and acknowledged that recent events had caused distress and confusion. He said that he wanted to address the situation directly, rather than allowing rumor and speculation to fill the void of information. He admitted that his marriage to Catherine had been troubled, that they had both made mistakes and caused each other pain. He said that Catherine had indeed written the letters that had been read at the Thornbury ball, but that those letters represented only a small piece of a much more complicated picture. Then he introduced Margaret Fletcher, who stood before the assembled crowd and told her story with remarkable composure. She described Catherine's unhappiness, yes, but also her moments of contentment, her love for her daughter, her conflicted feelings about Adrian. She revealed that Lady Thornbury had paid her to provide only the most damaging correspondence, that many other letters existed which painted a more nuanced portrait of the marriage. She said that Catherine had loved Adrian in her own way, even if she had not always been faithful to him, and that she had explicitly stated in several letters that Isabel was indeed his daughter, that whatever indiscretions she had committed, that particular rumor was false. The crowd listened in stunned silence as Margaret spoke, and I saw dawning realization on many faces that they had been manipulated, used as weapons in Lady Thornbury's personal vendetta against Adrian. When Margaret finished, Adrian spoke again. He said that he was not asking for pity or absolution, that the failures of his first marriage were his to own, but he said that Isabel was innocent of any wrongdoing, that she was his daughter beyond question, and that anyone who sought to harm her or exclude her from society would answer to him personally. He said that his current marriage had brought him more happiness than he had thought possible, that Eleanor had shown him what genuine partnership could look like, and that he would not apologize for loving her or for building a life with her. Then he did something that took everyone by surprise, including me. He spoke directly about class and privilege, about how society's rigid hierarchies had caused unnecessary suffering, about how his own adherence to those hierarchies had contributed to Catherine's unhappiness. He said that Eleanor had taught him that worth was not determined by birth, that the measure of a person lay in their character and their actions rather than their title. He said that if society chose to reject him for marrying beneath his station, then he would consider that rejection no great loss, because he would rather have Eleanor and Isabel and genuine love than all the empty approval of people who valued appearance over substance. His voice rang out in the ballroom, strong and clear, and I felt my heart swell with pride and love for this man who had finally learned to stand up not just for his reputation, but for what truly mattered. When he finished speaking, there was a moment of utter silence. Then, unexpectedly, the vicar began to applaud. Lady Pemberton joined him, and then several others, until perhaps half the room was clapping while the other half stood in uncomfortable silence. It was not a complete victory, not universal acceptance, but it was something. It was acknowledgement that we had fought back, that we had refused to be destroyed by scandal, and that some people, at least, recognized the truth when they heard it. Adrian took my hand, and we stood together facing the crowd, and I knew that whatever happened next, we had done all we could do. The reception continued for another hour, with guests dividing themselves into clear camps. Some approached us with genuine warmth and support, telling us they admired our courage and believed in our integrity. Others left quickly, uncomfortable with what they had heard but unable to argue with the facts as presented. A few remained hostile, convinced that no amount of explanation could erase the stain of scandal. But I noticed that even among those who disapproved, there was a new wariness, a recognition that we were not going to be easy targets for their judgment. We had teeth now, and we had shown ourselves willing to use them. After the last guests departed, Adrian and I stood alone in the entrance hall, exhausted but oddly elated. We had survived. We had faced down society's worst and come through it intact. Adrian pulled me into his arms and kissed me deeply, and I tasted relief and gratitude and love in that kiss. He told me that I had been right, that standing firm had been the correct strategy, and that he was grateful beyond measure to have me as his partner in all things. I told him that we had done this together, that neither of us could have managed it alone, and that this was what marriage should be, two people supporting each other through whatever difficulties life presented. In the weeks that followed, our social standing remained complicated, but gradually improved. Lady Thornberry found herself increasingly isolated as the truth about her manipulation came to light, and several families who had supported her publicly began to distance themselves privately. We were not restored to our former position in society, and we likely never would be, but we carved out a new place for ourselves, one based on authenticity rather than pretense. Some families refused to associate with us, but others drew closer, attracted by our honesty and our refusal to play by the old rules. We became something of a curiosity, a couple who had defied convention and survived, and while that brought its own challenges, it also brought a freedom we had not anticipated. Isabel flourished in this new environment, no longer forced to maintain the rigid, perfect behavior that had been expected of her before. She made friends among the children of the families who remained loyal to us, and she began to show a personality we had not fully seen before, mischievous and curious and full of joy. Adrian became increasingly comfortable with his role as father, spending hours with Isabel teaching her to ride and showing her around the estate, explaining how everything worked and why. I watched them together and saw the wounds of the past beginning to heal, saw genuine affection growing where there had been only distance and formality. Adrian and I settled into our marriage with increasing comfort and deepening love. We continued our evening routines, sitting together by the fire, talking or reading, and we shared a bed each night, finding comfort and passion in each other's arms. He became more openly affectionate, no longer afraid to show his feelings, and I marveled at the transformation from the cold, distant man who had first proposed this arrangement. We talked about having more children, about expanding our family, and the prospect filled me with joy rather than anxiety. I had never imagined that I could be this happy, that life could offer such abundance of love and connection. One evening in early spring, as we walked through the gardens with Isabel running ahead of us chasing butterflies, Adrian stopped and turned to face me. He took both my hands in his and told me that he wanted to renew our vows, to have a proper ceremony this time with all the words of love and commitment that had been absent from our first wedding. He said that he wanted to stand before God and our family and choose me again, consciously and joyfully, without the desperation and calculation that had marked our original union. He said that he wanted the world to know that this was not a marriage of convenience anymore, but a true partnership built on love and respect. I felt tears streaming down my face as he spoke, and I told him yes, absolutely yes, that I would marry him again and again for the rest of my life if that was what he wanted. We held the ceremony a month later in the small chapel at Hargrave Manor, with only our closest friends and the household staff in attendance. Isabel served as my flower girl, her face glowing with happiness as she scattered rose petals down the aisle. The vicar who had supported us through the scandal performed the service, and his words about love and commitment and choosing each other daily resonated deeply with both of us. When Adrian said his vows this time, his voice was steady and clear, full of conviction and emotion. He promised to love me and honor me all the days of his life, to be a true partner and companion, to never again retreat behind walls of coldness and distance. When I said my vows, I promised to stand beside him through whatever trials came, to love him with all my flaws and complications, to help him be the father Isabel deserved and the man he wanted to be. When the vicar pronounced us man and wife this time, Adrian kissed me with such tenderness and passion that I heard delighted laughter from our small audience. We turned to face them together, husband and wife in truth now, and I saw joy reflected in every face. Mrs. Dawson was crying openly, and even the footman looked moved. Isabel ran to us and we lifted her between us, the three of us embracing as a family. And I knew that this was what I had been searching for my entire life without knowing it. Not wealth or status or security, but this feeling of belonging, of being chosen and cherished, of having a place in the world that no one could take from me. The reception afterward was simple but lovely, with cake and champagne and dancing in the ballroom. Adrian and I danced together as we had at the Thornbury Ball, but this time there was no tension or anxiety, only joy and celebration. He held me close and whispered that I had saved him, that without me, he would have remained locked in his prison of ice and isolation, unable to feel or to love or to truly live. I told him that he had saved me too, that he had given me a life beyond my wildest dreams, and that I was grateful every day for the strange circumstances that had brought us together. We had started with a bargain made from necessity, but we had built something real and lasting, and I knew that whatever challenges the future held, we would face them together. As the evening drew to a close and the last guests departed, Adrian and I stood in the entrance hall as we had on that first night after the disastrous dinner party, but everything was different now. We were not strangers bound by obligation, but partners bound by love. We had weathered scandal and judgment and emerged stronger. We had learned to trust each other and to be vulnerable with each other. We had built a family from the wreckage of past failures and present imperfections. I looked at my husband, this complicated man who had so thoroughly captured my heart, and I felt nothing but gratitude and love. He took my hand and led me upstairs to our shared chambers, and as we passed Isabel's room, we could hear her singing softly to herself, a happy sound that made us both smile. We paused outside her door, listening, and Adrian put his arm around me and pulled me close. He told me that he had never imagined he could be this happy, that he had spent so many years believing that love was dangerous and vulnerability was weakness, and that I had shown him how wrong he had been. He said that every day with me was a gift, that raising Isabel together was a joy he had not anticipated, and that he looked forward to all the years ahead of us with hope rather than dread. I turned in his arms and looked up at him, this man I had married to save his name and whom I had come to love with all my heart. I told him that he had given me everything I never knew I needed, that he had seen worth in me when I struggled to see it in myself, and that I would spend the rest of my life showing him what real love looked like. He kissed me then, soft and sweet, and we stood there in the quiet hallway, holding each other as night settled over Hargrave Manor. We had started our journey in such unexpected ways, bound by necessity and social obligation. Two wounded people seeking shelter from the world's cruelty. But somewhere along the way, in the midst of scandal and struggle and slow revelation, we had found something neither of us had been looking for. We had found home in each other, and that was worth more than all the approval society could offer. Years later, when people asked about our marriage, I would tell them the truth. I would say that Adrian had married the seamstress to save his name, and that I had agreed because I needed security and a future. But I would also tell them what happened after, about the slow unfolding of understanding and trust, about the child who brought us together, about the scandal that tested us and the love that sustained us. I would tell them that the best things in life often come from the most unlikely circumstances, that love can grow in the rockiest soil if given patience and care, and that the courage to be vulnerable is the greatest strength any of us possess. And when they asked if I had any regrets, if I wished I had married for love instead of convenience, I would smile and tell them that I had done both, that the marriage of convenience had become a love match more profound than any romance novel could capture. And it was the truth, every word of it. I had stood in that chapel on our wedding day with no illusions about affection or attachment, had spoken vows I did not mean to a man whose eyes held nothing but cold calculation. But I had learned that love is not always a lightning strike, that sometimes it grows slowly, building day by day through shared experiences and hard-won trust. I had learned that the measure of a marriage is not how it begins, but how it endures, not the passionate declarations, but the quiet moments of understanding and support. And I had learned that calling someone by their name rather than their title, refusing to bow or scrape or diminish oneself, was not disrespect but the foundation of genuine partnership. Adrian had lost his heart not because I was obedient or deferential, but because I was myself, fully and unapologetically, and because I challenged him to be more than the cold, distant man he had trained himself to be. On quiet evenings, when Adrian and I sat together by the fire with Isabel sleeping peacefully upstairs, I would sometimes think back to that morning when Mrs. Dawson came to the sewing room to summon me to the study. I would remember the fear and the uncertainty, the desperate calculation of a woman with no options choosing the least terrible path forward. And I would feel grateful beyond measure that I had taken that leap, had accepted that strange proposal, had agreed to become the Duchess of Hargrave despite all the reasons not to. Because in doing so, I had found not just security and status, but love and belonging and purpose. I had found a family. I had found my place in the world. And I had found, in the most unexpected way, that I was exactly where I was meant to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do, with exactly the people I was meant to love. It had started with a bargain, but it had become so much more. It had become, quite simply, home.